I grew up in Navajo land. My family goes back to before the Long Walk. Our family histories are different from the white man's, in the fact that our people have almost no written history, except what the white interpreters have put to pen since they came into our lives. In the long-standing tradition of the Diné, or Navajo people, our family records were kept by certain objects and remembrances that our people mostly kept alive in memory by repetitive telling of a story by successive generations. Much like the white people sitting down with family and paging through book after book of old photographs, our past, out of necessity, is stored by repetition. Our people kept their mental pictures alive by retelling the stories, enhanced by paintings on pottery and plates, along with special pottery pieces sculpted after pets and animals of importance to the individual. The majority of these items of importance to our people were destroyed at the time of the Long Walk of the Navajo, and many of our Apache brothers. Many of our records of importance were burned and purposely smashed into sands by the soldiers. Caricatures depicting our long passed away pets and special remembrances, painstakingly painted over many long hours by our elders as a record of our entire history, were used by white soldiers for target practice. Much of this destruction was done purposefully to dehumanize and humble our people with such vindictiveness to reduce our ancestors to the level of animals. Our people's stories vary somewhat regarding the severity of this treatment, but there are few records of compassion, as our people were herded like cattle to the white man's Fort Sumner. Our storytellers told that after they began the Long Walk, many soldiers remained behind long enough to destroy as many of our homes and sacred sites as they could easily get to. They did this in plain sight of our departing people, so they would tell others that we had no home to return to. The most horrific and evil destruction they could have done was the seeking out of our sacred kivas. Those kivas contained the sacred sipapus, holes in the floor leading to the homes of the gods in the world beyond. These sacred sipapus were the way our gods exited this earthly world at the troubled times when our people were being enslaved by the Spanish, working in their gold and silver mines in Mexico. This was also the time when the departing gods created the legendary and horribly powered Yinallushi, or the Skinwalker, as an enforcer to stay behind to carry out the laws and protect our citizens. They allowed the Skinwalker to have a shape-shifting ability to change to other forms to aid it in remaining undiscovered, and thus it could become other creatures in order to spy for our people and assist in the escaping and eluding of our captors. The gods must also have had a way of foreseeing the future, as they made allowance for the Skinwalker to recreate itself if needed, but with the most horrible penalties and sacrifices they must suffer in order to accomplish this reproduction. There were very few of our sacred sipapus left undiscovered by the soldier, so we are concerned for the future because the Skinwalkers are certainly not a proper substitute to the gods of our creation, as they're basically just the most powerful, destructive, and evil witches one can imagine. Their sole purpose was just to protect and avenge. On the infrequent visits my parents were able to make to visit my grandparents, I was thrilled by the times that grandfather treated us kids to stories that his grandfather had told him about those terrible times that came very close to totally destroying the Navajo Nation. As I was raised far from my people's homeland, I enjoyed our visits by spending every possible moment asking questions and pestering my father's brothers, and especially grandfather. And I also recall once having been picked up and held by my grandfather's mother, and she introduced me to my great-grandfather, who at the time seemed to my boyish mind to have been the model for that old cigar store Indian at the drugstore in that old west town that I think was in Yuma. The man seemed ancient and scary to my young eyes, and that was the only time I saw him, because he passed away shortly after that. Over time, our younger people have been spoiled by the modern world, which is good, and if it weren't for our continuing presence of the Skinwalker, the reminders of our past would be much less frequent, I'm very sure. The ironic thing is that being reminded of the Skinwalker is akin to remembering the flu, bad to catch and glad when it's gone. I do recall hearing another story of our people's past on the long walk, and they talked about how the white soldiers shot at every bird and animal along the several 100-mile journey for fear that they might be Skinwalkers. Many of our people died on that perilous journey, and it's said that the death songs can still be heard echoing through those dark canyons. Many of our elders have heard the chanting of our people when the moon is full and the wind is light. Oftentimes when relaxing under a hunter's moon, I wonder why the Skinwalker has remained with us, since the need for such a terrible being seems no longer necessary for our people's safety. But also because it seems that nowadays it serves no purpose anymore. None at all. Our people find such a subject should be best left unspoken even, because they accept it as a will of our Creator. I feel the eyes of Skinwalkers as I write this, even though I know I'm secure in my home. Others feel this way also, because it comes up in quiet discussions with friends. Now don't get me wrong, as I do not mean to disparage a last gift from our gods for our people's protection, but it seems that by now, the Skinwalkers should have evolved, or possibly moved on. I've heard it said that the soldiers may have somehow destroyed that last connection between us and our gods by blowing up and closing the sepulchres. During the long stay in the land of the stranger, the ancient dwellings of our forefathers remained in the silent canyon of the Raven and the Eagle, and the winds of time smoothed and carved the cliff homes as to erase all but the most prominent, and my family had returned to their previous land, which held a long neglected cliff house. Now this small dwelling, my grandfather said, had originally been carved out and built by his grandfather's father. Very difficult to get up to, and without any more purpose. The 2-room dwelling became a place for us children to play in on occasion, when our sheep journeyed to this remote canyon to feast on the fresh offerings of new grasses. I remember as a child, with adults watching from below, being allowed to make the intensively long climb up the trail that ran along the side of the cliff. And when it arrived eventually at the canyon rim, the path, which was worn over centuries, had been smoothed by the eroding winds to be all but invisible. Often we youngsters would create new markings, such as piles of stones to better mark the trail to be seen from a distance, in order to move faster to the scattered cliff homes. My family's small bungalow had seldom been used, even when first finished according to the stories told to me by my father and his father. Our particular dwelling was quite small and not all that choice of a location, but the elders told how this cliff house carried with it a tale that our ancient relative had just about completed it when he brought his intended wife up to it before their wedding ceremony to get their feelings on how it should be completed. But they say a giant bird, probably a condor, had made a sudden swoop over the rim and frightened her so badly that she had fallen to her death below. After that, our great-great-great-grandfather never again visited the house, as it was considered to carry a curse, and obviously our people can at times be very superstitious. And stories were told for generations that the great bird had taken that corner of the house as his own. I always heard from my family that they kept these rumors alive to keep the young children off of the cliffs just for their own safety. When my parents met, father was an engineer and mother was working as a bookkeeper for the tribe. They lived about 40 miles from this canyon with my mother's parents. And shortly thereafter, they moved our family to Tucson, where I grew up, and my folks still live there to this day. As I was recovering from a serious illness, and since I was now living with my wife in Flagstaff, we decided to make a trip to see these long-lost relatives that were still within easy driving distance, and to visit those few remaining family before they were gone too. We ended up being invited to stay for a while with my grandparents, who were still living near the canyon, whose winds once more beckoned to me with memories of many of my most fond experiences that I never forgot. Especially my hours of enjoyment as I lay before my grandfather's fireplace on the large rug that grandmother had made on her loom. The rug was still there, and everything was just the same as how I remembered. The second day of our visit, after most of our reminiscences had been discussed, Grandfather took me aside and asked if I would do him a big favor and accompany him once more into the Canyon of Despair. This was a translation given the cliff house, but I forgot who or why it was named, and Grandfather couldn't remember either. We both had always assumed that it was because of the long walk. I remember one other vague recollection, that the large depression just inside the canyon entrance that the road had to curve around was named Kit's Kiva. Everyone knew it by that name, because the saying goes that it was named for the Kit Carson and the other older people that named it because rumors said that it was a direct passage to hell. Now, of course, I readily agreed to the trip. And the next morning, Grandfather and I headed out to the dark, narrow canyon in his 4x4 truck. I noticed that Grandfather kept glancing in the rearview mirror on our way to the canyon, and I didn't think anything of it until he did a double take. It was then that I looked back myself, and I could see the black shape in our vast floating dust cloud. Grandfather spoke then, breaking the pent-up tension that I had conjured up. He said he was sure that it was just a nosy local fellow that he'd never liked because he was the town busybody. He went on to say that the man was just a super nosy resident who snooped around town to spy on visitors in hopes of selling the occasional article to the local newspaper. Then we crossed the bridge over the rapidly flowing river, and I lost interest in the other car when I no longer saw it. Grandfather didn't seem all that concerned about being followed by the man, and I as well dismissed his presence by understanding how boring it would be to find excitement looking for a news story in a worse than boring small desert town. The canyon began to look familiar to me as I remembered the notch in the otherwise high vertical wall where the ancient trail suddenly headed up to the canyon, and suddenly there it was. Grandfather pulled right aside and parked about 30 feet away from the cliff, behind a series of purple sage bushes and a huge family of prickly pear. Taking our backpacks, we locked our doors, and Grandfather reached in to remove 2 flashlights and some sort of zipper bag from the glove box. Handing me one of the flashlights and placing his in the pouch of his backpack, he nodded to me. And as I put the flashlight in my pack, the elderly gentleman, who was certainly not acting his age, nor did he the entire climb to the top of the first plateau. Although we both kept glancing down at the canyon, I never saw the other vehicle. No sound of a motor, no accompanying dust cloud, nothing to show he had followed us to our present location. Grandfather didn't react one way or another, so the matter was soon forgotten again. It wasn't long before we were climbing up the steady incline along the cliff's gradually narrowing trail, etched over time by thousands of feet belonging to man and animal. The day was beautiful, temperature cool, but we knew it would soon warm up. A mild breeze against our backs and the 2 lightly filled backpacks in which Grandfather had obviously had Grandmother pack our lunch. And I could feel the slosh of water in the canteen as I clumsily tried recalling how to walk on a solid but uneven jagged rock. There were of course the sand piles collecting on the trail at periodic intervals, and although I kept a careful watch for the animal tracks, there were only the occasional prints from a coyote that must have recently preceded us on the path, as the tracks had yet to be obliterated by the constant canyon winds. The path was the way I remembered, windswept, exposed rocks and the hard, packed sand encrusted pathway, and only the occasional sign of hoof print from deer or maybe goats, and every now and then an animal dropping. Only one time did I see the excrement of a coyote, and to make certain, I opened a large scat pile and found it to be full of hair. Definitely a coyote. Maybe the same one that left today's prints. Grandfather had glanced back at that moment and said if I was through playing, we were almost there. Could have easily passed the small window without notice, as the tiny entrance to this cliff house was around the corner of an ancient slab of granite. There, Grandfather turned sharply, crossed behind a huge boulder that had most likely fallen from the mountain peak, looming above centuries ago. Following him around the tall column, I would have continued on the trail had Grandfather not stopped short, holding up his hand for silence. I did not dare to move a muscle, the way both my father and this stern gentleman had taught me. Then with a smile, Grandfather guided me to my immediate left around the tall spire, and then a tight squeeze back right, 3 stone steps down, and another sharp left, and we stepped inside the cliff. The drastic difference from the granite of the huge fallen monolith to the soft, sound-muffling sandstone of the mountain was amazing. The entrance was cruder and much smaller than I remembered from childhood, and if I hadn't known better, I would have thought this to be a cave rather than a shelter carved out by humans. As we ducked inside, the light was almost totally obscured, but Grandfather stepped further in, allowing me to step fully inside as well. This let the light to again bring us visibility. And then as the large sunburnt hand of my grandfather reached out to remove the adobe brick from the hand-carved rectangular slot, it was as if someone had flipped a light switch. Now I could clearly see what I remembered from childhood that caused me so many nightmares. Seeing this small, claustrophobic hideout again, after so very many years, brought back memories of playing Jesse Jane and a whole raft of movie characters. And I distinctly remember fighting off General George Custer as he and his cavalry tried to assault my fortifications. I could see the bloodstains where I had put a fatal arrow through Jack Palance as he was about to cut my dog's throat. While I was reminiscing about my many triumphs as a child, I noticed Grandfather kneeling over the body of a Black Hawk warrior, when my dream was interrupted by his saying, "Bring your flashlight." I was now back, immediately done daydreaming. Immediately pulled from my amazing childhood memories. Now kneeling down on the soft sand of the floor, I removed my backpack and placed it next to that of my grandfather's, besides the irregular cut bricks that were carefully and decoratively placed on each side of the very small fire pit. I remember as a youngster scouting the outside areas above this space for enough sticks and broken tree branches to kindle a small fire in this pit to cut the evening chill in this otherwise miserable canyon, and how quickly the small confines of this room all weeded up. Now, for some unknown reason, Grandfather was dismantling a decorative brick inside the fireplace that, as kids, my cousins and I were forbidden to touch. We had been warned that a terrible witch, much more evil and powerful than even the Skinwalkers, had been sealed inside, and to release it would bring total destruction to our people. Could my grandfather be unaware of this curse, and the witch just inside be waiting to be released? Grandfather must have noticed my hesitation and the panicked look that I couldn't help but show, because he paused and relaxed a moment. Then Grandfather proceeded to clear his throat and he lit a cigarette. I was expecting to now receive the grandfather-grandson talk that would make me a good person in life. Quite the opposite actually happened. Instead, Grandfather explained that when his family first had reacquired this ancient property, he had made a discovery that he never dared tell anyone except his own father. And he said his father forbade him to tell any other soul, even his own son, who was my father, about this enormous treasure hidden in this room. He went on to explain that there was, according to his father, some sort of a curse that was put on this treasure when it was hidden by the Anasazi gods, that would destroy anyone that dared to spend it in riches until a certain point in the alignment of the stars had been reached. Grandfather then said that the sign had happened 3 weeks before my arrival, and he took my surprise visit to be a sign from the gods to use these riches once I had arrived and our circle was complete. Which I hardly understood, because when I heard the word treasure, my mind closed immediately. He told me he did not have any idea of the value of what we were about to see, but now I understood the reason for so much secrecy. All of those years playing in this cliff house with a treasure only feet away. Grandfather again moved to the bricks that were so loosely stacked on top of each other, and casually flipped them on the floor between us while I would toss them into a growing pile in the far corner. In a matter of minutes, we had cleared enough bricks away to reveal a black hole cut and dug into the sandstone wall behind. There were a number of bags, and upon opening the first one by cutting the tight leather string at the top, the contents jingled out in a slippery pile, and we were staring at coins, gold coins. The markings on them appeared to be Spanish, and Grandfather said he had suspected from stories handed down from our ancestors that some of our family had rebelled at some point in the past and stolen a lot of the newly minted gold from their Spanish slave masters and escaped back up north toward their homeland, but no further word of their fate were ever learned. Here we were, my grandfather and I, staring at a pile of untold wealth, trying hard to even comprehend such apparent riches, having no remote idea of the value of the coins in front of us. We were both too overwhelmed to do more than pile it all into an area about 3 feet in diameter and maybe a foot high. We finally were able to move again, and Grandfather suggested dividing it into equal amounts in our backpacks for easier carrying, which we then proceeded to do. We had no more finished loading our packs and fastening the final straps when we heard an audible click that sounded like a firecracker. As we both turned to look at the source of the sound, there stood a scroungy-looking man with a revolver in his right hand, clearly aiming at my grandfather. No amount of preparation could have been able to equal the fear I was now experiencing, both for myself and obviously for my grandfather. The scroungy man then barked in a gruff, sort of barely understandable series of broken words as if he was constantly trying to clear his throat, saying we should do nothing to make him kill us. I could detect a foul odor that I could not identify until it triggered the memory of an event several years before when I came on a similar smell. That was the stench of a several-day-old deer that had bloated until its guts had virtually exploded and the stench of rotten meat was gagging. The smell from this filthy being was the same foul, stomach-turning stench. I remembered how Grandfather had placed that other zippered bag alongside his flashlight in his backpack, which at the time I recognized it as a handgun case, and I noticed his hand slowly getting closer to his pack. My mind was racing to try and anticipate what Grandfather was planning to do, and I just hoped he actually did have a gun inside that zippered bag in his pack. I desperately tried to find a way in which I could somehow distract this foul person long enough for Grandfather to reach into his bag, unzip the pouch, and retrieve his own gun, and depending on whether it was a pistol or a revolver, how long it would take in seconds before he could fire. My mind was trying to weigh the odds. What if Grandfather's gun was a pistol? And if it was, did it have a round in the chamber, or did he have to pull back the slide and seat the cartridge before he could shoot? Perhaps he didn't even have a loaded magazine. Looking back now, I must have been in a panic with my mind racing through a guesswork of useless scenarios. I tried desperately to mentally calculate the time that I would need to distract the man for Grandfather to be able to shoot. I wished feverishly for a clue, and I was about to take a chance by a quick turn as I sat there on the ground. Maybe I'd get lucky with a sweeping kick, and as I was calculating the length of my kick, the man spoke. He choked out in his raspy voice that maybe he could make a deal so nobody had to die. Grandfather obviously knew this man's identity, because he had previously been following us, but we thought he had stopped. Then the man made a confusing statement that he knew that Grandfather had seen him following, as there was no way to cover the fact that he was behind it. So we parked just over the bridge and came the rest of the way as a deer. Obviously that sounded crazy, and I thought he might be drunk, but he continued to talk and he told Grandfather that he'd been listening to us and he laid out his reasoning. He said he didn't care about killing us, but he knew there would be questions that might somehow implicate him. So then he offered a deal where Grandfather could split the money in exchange for our lives. He told Grandfather that he'd been listening, and that he knew that there were 2 backpacks, and they were each equally filled with the riches. And if we wished to remain alive, he would agree to split the riches and take only one of the backpacks. Grandfather quickly consented and pushed a pack toward the slimy man, careful to retain the pack holding what I suspected was a gun. Then in a flash, the man was gone and my nostrils were again hit with fresh air. That stench was gone. I had been correct in my assumption as I watched Grandfather remove that zippered case and retrieve a 9mm pistol. And then he replaced the empty magazine from the pistol with a loaded one from another compartment. It was at that moment that I began to tremble, and after a few more shakes I was able to explain my reaction to Grandfather, and he made a gesture of wiping his brow and gave me a grin and a wink of an eye. We returned to the pickup with our treasure. On the way back, I asked Grandfather what the horrible man meant when he made the comment that he came as a deer. Grandfather burst out laughing, and then he explained that the man was known as a Skinwalker witch, and he obviously shapeshifted to the body of a deer. He further explained that the body of a deer was a preferred shape for these witches to take, as they could run as fast as a car in these sandy areas, and that was how he arrived so soon after we did. We made a quick return to the 4x4 as dusk was upon us. We were almost back to the river as I could see the trees that lined the fast-flowing body in both directions, and then the last vestige of sun rays set behind the far mountain, and Grandfather turned on the headlight. Finally, we were approaching the one-lane concrete bridge when a police car suddenly appeared with its roof lights flashing and blocked the road. Beyond the police car, sitting at an angle with its hood smashed into the steel girder, was a large dump truck. The officer exited his car and approached Grandfather's open window with an apology for the delay, and he said that the truck evidently hit a large deer, and at that moment the truck driver came over and he was mumbling to the officer that it was the craziest thing he'd ever seen. He said something like, "Here comes a large buck and he had some sort of bag stuck in his antlers. It seemed to slip around, so he didn't see the dump truck turn onto the bridge. The driver said the poor creature didn't know what hit him and had sailed clean over the hood of the truck into the river." He went on to say he knew for certain the deer was dead, because, as he pointed, he said, "There's the back haunches," and apparently his bumper had cut the deer in half. Grandfather looked over at me with a sigh and he said, "Maybe he should have become a condor instead." I always believed my grandfather to be a very wise man, and in that sentence, he couldn't have been any wiser. My name is Jane, and my wife's name is Cleo, and we both finally retired after a long and stressful career. We purchased a 34-foot motorhome with the intent of spending a couple of years staying in RV parks in different parts of the country to see where we'd be happiest to settle down. We bought a Jeep Wrangler to tow behind, as our first spot on the list was the Southwest. Our top priority on the wish list is outdoor fun. That's why the four-wheel drive. Because of certain events we are about to disclose, we cannot reveal the exact location at this time, of fairness to the property owner. We had leased a rather remote site that had about 1/8 of an acre per spot and a total of 12 places for RVs, each with its own water and sewer hookup. Each space was surrounded by desert shrubs and plants to assure almost total privacy from our neighbors. We realized immediately upon receipt of the information packet that this place was perfect for us, having both been in the high-stress business of management for our entire career. Now, all we wanted was to have as little contact with others as possible, at least for a year or so. We needed some unwind time, and that's how the retired physicist and his wife had represented this property that they had recently developed to cater to us, new and soon-to-be recluses. We had secured a 1-year lease on this spot quite by chance, and they had opened it only a month prior to our arrival. And as it was through Cleo's boss that we had heard about it, we settled in quickly. That's the nice thing about a motorhome. We didn't have to unpack. We immediately made the large table on the patio our favorite area. It was surrounded by cacti and various desert plants and flowering bushes, sitting there with a beautiful view of the desert below us and the red mountains beyond. It looked like a scene from a John Ford Western. We could certainly appreciate that, as we planned to spend a lot of time out in the huge area of canyons and the dunes. Being quite a comfortable ways from us, we could barely hear any of the engine noises from our nearest neighbor, and since we were only able to see their place from a certain spot on our patio, we really had all the privacy we could hope for. Our nearest neighbors had just had a visitor, and from where we were sitting, we could barely see it was a fancy sports car. Then, not 5 minutes later, the neighbors headed out over the narrow but deep arroyo behind them. They had the top down on their old Jeep, and their guest must have been the person bouncing in their back seat. Being as how this was our goal to soon explore that canyon, we brought out our binoculars to get an idea of where was the best way to get into this canyon. The bridge over that arroyo was accessible to all residents, so we now knew the way into the vast canyons behind it. We watched as the people left the concrete bridge and ventured out into the desert. We discussed how maybe we could find out from these neighbors the points of interest, but that could wait until later. We really preferred to not establish any relationships at this point, and as the owners had advised us, to not expect any welcoming visits from any of the 11 residents. so we were obviously in good company, or maybe I should say, not good company. All depends on what you're looking for. Cleo had turned her lounger at more of an angle so she could watch the Jeep, as we had yet to go exploring and we were getting anxious. As the Jeep entered an obvious dry wash, it suddenly veered to the left and almost totally disappeared from our view. All we could see was an occasional waft of dust as it rose out of the Jeep's path and was quickly dispersed by the constant breathing. We were very interested now because we were both looking forward to our first outing. The signs of the Jeep soon disappeared entirely and we settled back, discussing our plans for our own exploration, when another dust cloud appeared way off to the right of where we last saw our neighbor's rig. We knew that there was another road indicated on our map that entered at the far end of the canyon from our extreme right. But this dust was coming from almost beneath the high cliff in the center. It took about another 20 minutes of watching the growing dust cloud until we could finally make out the type of vehicle, and it was the same Jeep. The difference was that now there were only 2 people. Their passenger wasn't there. Funny how we both kind of squished down in our chairs so as not to let them know we were watching. But the thoughts were racing through our minds. Did they drop their guest off at a campsite? Were they maybe going to return and camp overnight? Just as we were discussing our other nosy thoughts, the people came back outside their motorhome and the lady got into the visitor's car and began leaving with her husband in the Jeep following her out. Then they were out of sight behind our thick trees and the sounds of their engines died out. They were gone. We knew it had to be the lady and her husband, and now our curiosity was truly piqued. We then hustled around outside the patio and slightly rearranged the latticework standing on the cement blocks, making the edge of the patio so that we each had a good line of sight, but also repositioning our table and chairs slightly to take better advantage of the hedge behind us. We knew that now we were totally hidden from their view, yet we could spy on them. We laughed at how we were over-dramatizing what was probably something that was just none of our business and innocent. But Cleo said she simply liked to watch people, obviously from private. I still thought we were just being nosy. That is, until 2 hours later, when we were in the coach and heard the distant sound of a vehicle approaching. We both sprinted to the patio and slid into our chairs. When the people returned, they were both in the Jeep. Now we pondered out loud, what possible reason could this have all been about? There could be any number of explanations that didn't even rate discussing, so we dropped any further thought of the incident. That is, until a few days later, when we were enjoying our patio, which was now our favorite place for relaxation. Camouflage painted 4x4 pickup pulled into the site down below, and the couple both came out of their RV and they shook hands all around. Then the visitor handed the man what appeared to be an attaché case. Yes, through my 12-power binoculars, it was an attaché case. No, I wasn't spying. I simply kept the glasses there on the table for actual bird watching. Very soon the same scenario played out as before. They disappeared into the canyon once more, all 3 in the Jeep, and by the same route as the last time, we once again watched the dust balls swirl out of the dry creek bed, only to be dispersed by the constant wind. Soon, the dust was heading for the same distant cliff area as before. After another hour and a half, here came the Jeep, and this time we thought there may have been a third person, but it was just a tan tarp covered with dust. Only the husband and his wife returned yet again. The performance was again the same as before. In a very few minutes, he drove their guest's big camo truck and she followed in the Jeep. 2 or so hours later, they returned in the Jeep and everything returned to their usual quiet routine. In fact, when we thought about it, we had yet to see them doing anything in their yard or outside except take these drives. We tried to shake it off and just decided that at least we spent time on our patio drinking wine and it was fun to spy on them. But that settled it. Our curiosity had us going stir crazy until a few days later another car pulled into their yard. We almost missed it because it was almost totally concealed by their blossoming hedge. Just as before, the same scenario repeated, and the giant-looking dude almost couldn't have fit in their Jeep if top had not been down. There they went, with the wife in the back seat, and they took their usual route down into the wash, and soon they were only a distant dust cloud yet again. We now put our nosiness plan into action, as we grabbed our prepared backpacks, complete with bottled water, snacks, binoculars, and of course guns. Out we went, jumped into our Jeep, and turned off just before our driveway hit the entrance road, and followed the short curve to the left and down to the other road that was about 300 yards away from the desert entrance, the same used by our neighbor. We had just been out this way a couple of times before, but had never gone more than a few hundred feet or so, just to see how easy the going would be in this world of sand. The neighbor's rig was already throwing up a small cloud of dust, but as usual, they kept their speed and their dusty presence fairly low. We did the same, only I drove out into the desert further until I got on a fairly distinct route that perhaps had been a rather well-used trail before the property had been developed into our lease, thus changing the route and making it nearly impossible for non-residents to even find a route into the desert from our remote locale. We were now heading in roughly the same direction as the other Jeep, but knowing that the others would never see us through the large dust cloud they were kicking up behind them, I increased my speed quite a bit until I felt we were slightly gaining on them in case they made another sudden turn, so I edged up a little further. This road hadn't been used for a while, so we kept bucking the drifts that kept us on slant most of the way. All we could see of the other Jeep was dust as it remained down in the wash the entire way. Soon their dust cloud became smaller in size, which indicated they were slowing, so I hung back a bit and slowed down as well. Suddenly their Jeep appeared briefly as it fairly leaped out of the dry wash and up onto the sand, and almost instantly it disappeared around a large clump of prickly pear, and then the dust cleared. I cut the engine immediately, and as we carefully opened our doors, there was no sound of the other engine, and I only hoped I had been in time and that they hadn't heard us, although we were still quite a long ways back. The constant howling of the canyon winds definitely helped mask all of our sounds. We carefully pushed our doors closed, and carrying our packs, we stealthily went forward at just short of a crawl. We were traveling in a small depression of another dry wash, and as we peered around a very large and very old saguaro, we saw the three people about 200 feet ahead. They were almost to the short rock outcropping of smooth sandstone that dominated the spectacular scenery in this country. The party disappeared from sight around the sandy mound, and we took the opportunity to run as fast as we could, our backpacks flapping and making us wish we had taken time to just adjust them properly. We stayed off to the side of their tracks with a good 60 or so feet so they wouldn't see our tracks whenever they returned. It was then that we heard the sound like a muffled gunshot. It seemed to echo throughout the canyon for only a few seconds, as if we were far away. Did they drive all the way out here for target shooting? No more shots sounded, so we both thought that they might have seen a rattlesnake, and out here they were plentiful. This is definitely what we were hoping. When we cautiously peered around the sand mound where they were, there was the couple coming out of what appeared to be an ever so small crack in the high red cliff. Their passenger, however, was no longer with them. They couldn't have passed more than 100 feet from where we crouched on hands and knees as they went back to their Jeep. We could almost hear our hearts beat as we held our breaths. I was perspiring profusely as I could envision them seeing our Jeep, which would have been visible had they climbed even the shortest dune. But then the reassuring sound of their engine roared, and as I slowly peered alongside a purple sage, I saw the welcome sight of their rapidly departing dust cloud. We quickly began searching for their tracks from the cliff, and Cleo called out as she followed their footprints to the cliff face. I quickly caught up, and we carefully, nervously approached the narrow crack in the cliff. The jagged entrance was about 3 feet across, and there was an old branch of some sort of a gnarly tree standing just inside. It was then that we noticed that the footprints had been obliterated to about 4 feet out from the wall of the cliff. Obviously, these people had erased the signs that they had entered this crack, leaving the rest of their trail to the winds. What appeared to be a dead end would certainly have discouraged us from proceeding further had it not been for what we had very obviously seen and heard. And the man had disappeared. All of our thoughts of them maybe shuttling friends to a big campout were now lost in suspicion. Where have all the guests been going? On hands and knees we crept forward, and using the flashlights from our backpacks, we scrutinized the area around the sandstone rock from the bottom of the cut, and we were able to easily slide it aside. It was lighter than I had assumed. The sand that blocked the hole beyond had apparently been pushed up as the people departed. And had we not known better, we would never have thought of entering what could well be a cavern full of snakes. That is what we newcomers to the desert all envisioned from tales of Indiana Jones. Slithering along our bellies, we were soon on our feet once again, and in the small room about the size of a couple of beach cabanas. To all appearances, there was nothing to see, and the 7 or so feet high ceiling made it very claustrophobic. I made one quick sweep of the perimeter and was about to call it quits when I noticed a rather ominous dark crack behind a vertical column in the very far corner of this cave, and as I approached, the sand suddenly began sliding out from under my feet. I reacted quickly and jumped back. I called Cleo over, and using our lights together, we saw that there was a dark, jagged hole alongside the rock column into which the loose sand was steadily draining due to my movements. I looked around and found a football-sized piece of red rock, which I carefully tossed into the hole, and as we listened, we could hear the thump, 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 as the rock evidently headed to somewhere deep beneath us. We both let out audible gasps as our eyes met, and we both experienced a horrible fear of what we had discovered. Using the stick by the entrance, we now found ourselves erasing signs of our own presence, and fled the scene like the devil himself was behind us. When we got back to our Jeep, I took an even more indirect route when I found another trail that cut off to our left, and in 4x4 low, I kept on that course that took us further away from the road we'd come in on, and when we were a good 3 miles from where we had followed from the other Jeep through the wash, I turned right again and headed back to our same cutoff to home in high range once more. So it would appear to watchful eyes that we were just exploring the desert. The first thing upon arriving home, we sneaked a peek at our neighbor's house, and found both vehicles were gone. We quickly washed our Jeep, and it dried fast in the bright sunlight. So later on, when our neighbors returned home, we were once again having a glass of wine on the patio. We didn't know if they ever looked, but we had to assume that common sense would dictate it. Now was the hard part. Without revealing our suspicion, how to go about seeking help from the authorities. We waited until the next day and headed into the city and to the nearest state police agency. I won't say where because they started out by being extremely rude. Anyway, there was no apparent missing persons reports, and after 2 intense hours, we were about to leave when an officer burst into the room and asked us to once again describe the vehicles that we'd been seeing. Now that we had attention, and a lot of it, even so, that the authorities immediately placed us under protective custody, and the place began to buzz. You'd have thought that we had discovered a live bomb from all of this activity, and think we had just been rudely ignored. 2 large helicopters landed in the parking lot, and outpoured no less than 10 people in both uniforms and suits. We were asked again about the vehicles we had seen, and then the officers produced photographs of somewhere in the 20s of various cars and trucks. One that looked a lot like our neighbor's Jeep. We identified the ones we had seen, and they still didn't say much, but we were flown to Phoenix, still under protective custody, and sequestered into a splendid hotel with all the amenities. Had everything not been because of such a frightening reason, it might have almost been fun, like we were being spoiled. We were sworn to silence under what they had told us was a gag order. Evidently, we must have stumbled onto something big. Only after arrests were made, that included our neighbors and 13 other people, did we finally learn what was behind all of this. By then, we had been allowed to return home. A substantial reward was given to us, and due to the possibility of further repercussions, we have had to move twice, and now live under different names. And finally, they also gave us permission to send you our story, which we had to have these people review first. We just wanted to get this out, and they needed to read it and approve that we were okay to say this. The entire plot involved a very sinister group of criminals who perpetrated crimes under the guise of the Skinwalker. All of these main members of the conspiracy were posing as members of the Navajo. But it has now been proven that although they were all deemed to be Native American, except for a few like our neighbors, none of the offenders were Navajo at all. The entire plot centered on offering the rituals and training to allow these imposters to become the witches known as Skinwalkers. These people knew that for a Navajo to become a Skinwalker, the base requirement was that the candidate must first kill a blood relative. These bloody gangsters, as the chief investigator told us, were charging enormous amounts of money with the promise of performing ceremonies to allow these men to join the Navajo tribe and become Skinwalkers. This would allow them to become invisible, and they were enticed with untold riches amounting to millions of dollars. The investigators said that this conspiracy was fairly easy to pull off because the Navajos are the envy of the other tribes. And even though the Skinwalker is so terrifying that even the Navajo avoid even mentioning it, these people paid huge amounts of money thinking that they could become fabulously wealthy with the new powers of the shapeshifting and invisibility. Our neighbors down below us were brought in to be the final solution when the suckers had been bilked out of all that they could squeeze out of them, and they began getting mad and threatening to expose the scam. These people were then told that their procedures were now ready to go, and the trip to the desert was to visit the secret cavern wherein they would receive their indoctrination by the most sacred Skinwalker. The hole we discovered must have been very deep, as the couple admitted to bludgeoning most of the candidates, but in a few instances where they said the men became belligerent, they just pushed them into the hole alive.